Hello, I'm Sora Luxon, and this is Planetary Magick, Saturn. Most people would argue that Saturn and its transits are the most powerful, or at least the most important in planetary magics, which is very important when you bring to mind just how much of society's functions are based on comprehensions and applications of planetary magics, astrology. Sometimes people who aren't of an occult persuasion cringe to hear someone say that sort of thing, that society is so applied to planetary magic. And they'll think automatically, perhaps, that practitioners of the craft are referring to how culture is based on horoscopes or some nonsense. But any adept knows that isn't what we mean at all. Most of society and its messages to the mass unconscious are symbolic, and a majority of those symbols are based on astrology. It's just that these occulted signals are, like most high magics, ever functioning from just behind the curtain. They're very well hidden in plain sight. Ancient energies that are embedded into everything we do and even how we think. Whenever you refer to a day of the week, you refer to a seven origin sphere. That is, seventh traditional planet or Norse god, given primacy over a season, which is quartering a system of linear time based on the functions of the Earth's environs and shifts due to, wait for it, the changing relation of the sun. Right? See, more planetary powers given merit in language, description, and in how we frame our very reality. We take the old gods and give them new names. We take the old symbols and center them into other symbols. Sometimes we just mouth the words like Saturday, Saturn's day, which is also the Sabbath of Judaism, without even the slightest conscious knowledge of the sphere of influence we invoke and bless in doing so. But the powers themselves are always the same, no matter how we dress them over time or mask them or think we've forgotten them. We have not, and we do not. In the great subconscious, they rule from behind the scenes by being right in front of us, just as they always have since we've ever began acknowledging them and built our world, cultures, and societies upon them. The difference between the practicing astrological occultist and the non-initiate who cringes and thinks of the charlatan's horoscopes is only this. The occultist knows that the planets and planetary magic don't just or only describe the actual material orbs in space, right? That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about high hermetic planetary magic or Enochian astrology, right? The planets' names do label these objects, these planets that are in space, in science. Yes, those are the labels they're given scientifically, but they also correspond to more than just the spheres in our solar system, right? So when we're calling on planetary powers, we're also calling on something else. They also relate to specific characteristics or traits, if you will, and that's how we're applying them in magic. Traits within the human psyche, in the mind, certain aspects of the subconscious. We all know, for instance, that Venus attributes love, whether it's Da Vinci's painting of a naked woman on a seashell, or the goddess of the Romans, or simply the symbol of the feminine, which is also the symbol of the planet Venus in astrology. When we hear or see or think Venus, we also think love, and in a much more hidden but incredibly powerful way. When we love, when we have that emotion, we know subconsciously that the same quality is being invoked in the same connection of symbolic messages, only in the other direction. So when we hear Venus or her son Cupid and we consciously think of love, we also when we love, invoke Venus subconsciously. The same can be said of the rulership of Mars to the emotions of aggressive passion or violent anger. These connections are already conditioned into us. We all make these connections automatically. By the nature of the occulted powers always having been there and always being there, right? Just operating constantly in front of everyone, who then, of course, believes themselves to be unaware or ignoring them, perhaps. You aren't. You can't. You're a part of it. You're definitely having that connection go on in your mind. Like, so much to do with the subconscious and high occultic magic. It simply isn't possible for you to be ignoring these influences in your psyche. Everyone's either using magic or being used by it. The only difference is between those who know it and those who don't. The planetary powers, personalities, for lack of a better descriptor, or just to use as a descriptor, are how we mold characters in our stories, in our books, in our movies, mythologies, legends, traditions. Everyone knows a war god's going to be aggressive and is going to carry the personality trait of, say, a fiery disposition, right? Fiery, the red planet, Mars. The individuals we encounter in real life, the characters in our own daily plays, we define and relate to them in the same way. It's a construct of our conditioning of our reality. Oh, Dave, he's always so happy and energetic, so bright. He has such a sunny disposition. See, sunny, planetary power being acknowledged for its perceived attribute influence in another person as a personality trait or a character trait. Your own differing and shifting emotions and states of mind carry the same attributes. And yes, your subconscious mind, which is actually the majority of who you are and how you behave, is completely aware of the planetary powers and your acknowledgement of them as part of the construct of your concept of reality entirely. Even trees, plants, herbs carry planetary correspondences that you subconsciously know of. It's often why specific ingredients are used in specific magic rituals or spells. Saturn's metal is lead, the densest, heaviest metal for the heaviest planet. Ever think about the term heavy metal as a music genre? Yeah, now you will. We all are connected. And we have these corresponding attributes as part of ourselves. And what's more, we agree upon them and constantly invoke them. Occultists simply go further by knowing that that's going on, acknowledging it, and then by taking those same signs, planets, and positions that everyone already has and applying method to their magic by which we can work with those powers directly, which is quite useful if you're, say, prone to a violent temper, for instance. Come into your own with planetary magic and you can make Mars serve you rather than you living your life as a constant struggle serving it. The same applies to all the other planetary rulers. With magic, you can rule them usefully. Shift them, move them, accede to them, embrace them humbly, apply them forcefully, etc., rather than being ruled by them. To start, you'll find if you don't already have one, which you might, right? If you're Wiccan or a magician or a warlock or a shaman or a druid or witch, whatever background you might be coming from in the occult, right? If you don't already have one, but you probably do if you have a background in the occult, since there are so many, you're going to need a simple book or source of material on astrology that includes planetary correspondences. Almost every half-decent book on astrology has such a list in it. 777 by Aleister Crowley is a book that is this list, right, of those correspondences. I'll make a video at some point briefly detailing a summary of the most general or common ones for anyone who needs it. But these planetary videos, like this podcast right here that I'm doing, really should be helpful as well, since each is describing a planet in magical detail. The basics are going to be fairly easy to memorize, since they are so repeated in day-to-day life. Once you know what you're looking at, they'll soon become quite obvious, so obvious that they'll become impossible not to see. Harmonies have a way of resonating quite loudly once we know how to hear them. So coming to an understanding of the planets and their powers and where they are vibrating on or off pitch in your own life won't be difficult as you learn to take the opportunity to look to find them. The symbol for Saturn looks a bit like a lowercase h and lowercase t got together and had a baby. A sort of little fancy H with an extra line through it at the top. On the tree of life, Saturn corresponds to the Sephiroth Bina, which is on the pillar of severity rather than mercy. And being on the negative pillar, Saturn does catch a lot of grief, even from Hermetic and Enochian Magi circles, as being negative or as having a negative disposition, mostly because it's the ruler of death. But just like the tree has two polarizing pillars, just as everything has polarity, so do all of the planets, and that includes Saturn. It has both its negative and its positive energies. When people think of Saturn, including magical Saturn, it has both negative and positive influences. But people tend to think of limitations, obstacles, the color black, because that is Saturn's color. Also things like discipline, or the word no itself, that negation, no. The father-esque disciplinarian figure, or any sort of strict authority figure. Comments like, oh, Saturn's in transit, so stuff's not going to go my way, or I'm going to have to be extra disciplined, or I'm going to have to work extra hard because Saturn's in this house of my chart. So when I go to do this, I'm going to have to work extra hard at this, 10 times harder than anybody else would. That sort of thing. But in being the ruling power of limitation, Saturn also carries authority over boundary, and boundaries are quite useful and necessary. So you can see how in that way it's a positive thing. Even though it's on the negative pillar and it is a negation, Saturn has its positives. And Saturn only takes responsibility for natural death. It's the planet of death, but only of natural death or natural decay that occurs in the correct and natural time for it to occur, which is an extremely necessary process. Right? Saturn doesn't murder. That's Mars. And an acorn has to split and rot for a tree to grow from it in time. That's natural death, natural cycling, natural recycling. All benefits granted by Saturn's powers of time, decay, death, and cycle. Saturn hates to waste. It draws a tight circle and keeps everything just where it should be. No more, no less. Magical work with Saturn will give the disorganized person the organization needed, possibly desperately required, to get something important like a big project or goal accomplished. Why are so many elitists minimalists, right? It's all that organizational energy of Saturn being used in all of its occult, alchemical, planetary glory. And people who have rulership of planetary magic are going to be both powerful and successful in anything they set out to do. Saturn hates waste. Waste in time, waste in resources, in mental or environmental chatter or clutter. Saturn cleans it up, puts it back where it should be, rots it back into the something else it was going to become. Saturn is a force of necessary destruction rather than chaotic destruction. Things are supposed to die and rot and move on. Otherwise, the energy gets stuck. That's Walking Dead type bad destruction when the system gets kinks, right? And energy can't move on. Saturn kills stuff so that there aren't eternally diseased, rotty things wandering around. So in that way, Saturn's this very good, positive thing. When we appease Saturn, we see that death is a beauty. It's this beautifully required process rather than something to be feared. We acknowledge that it is the obstacles that confront us that allow us to challenge ourselves, improve, and overcome them where we may. We come to know the wisdom that is limitation. Limitation which allows for things like physical reality. Otherwise, everything would be chaos. We can use the limiting power of Saturn to bind or banish limitations we might have, like binding or banishing too much grief that's out of balance and creating chaos, or banishing a resource limitation like poverty. It's a Saturn circle of boundary we cast every single time we cast a circle to do ritual magic. It is because Saturn is responsible for taking things away that we can do that it can and does bind and banish things or create a boundary line which in with we can hold authority. So no, we might not always like Saturn taking things away from us. But again, it has this positive dualism as well. Sometimes we need things taken away from us. Saturn is bitter, cold, and deadly serious. It knows and does its duty. It rules over contract, obligation, responsibility. A contract is, after all, a type of limit line. It's considered binding. And sometimes it's that sort of stoic, eternally patient, unmoving authority that's needed to draw a line so that it won't ever be crossed, to create the boundaries we need in order to function, to create the structure or organization that reigns in recklessness or foolhardy imbalances. Also, limitation itself is a power wholly to be appreciated. If there were no limitations, if there were no boundaries between things or spaces or effects, all would be chaos, right? You couldn't tell the difference between point A and point B if there were no boundary there. How could you tell the difference between anything at all without some sort of a limit set in place? All the other planets fall within Saturn's orbit ring. It creates the boundary. Why do we say father time rather than mother time? Because Saturn rules the binding authority of manifested time, and it's a father discipline figure. As the karmic planet of cyclical manifestation, Saturn also rules over time as we perceive it on the material plane, which again, that's why father time. It is the planet of death. Death is a temporal effect because death is a part of the cycle of physical life. Saturn rules over the physical manifest plane, and that must invariably include death because everything within the confines of this plane are within the confines of time on this plane, and so must die. Time is a binding physical limitation. It's because of this that Saturn's powers are those of things like erosion, disintegration, dilution, the breaking back down into dust, decomposition. These are the same planetary attributes seen cross-culturally in concepts of any kind of hellish dark chasm or void type realm. In Hel herself, the half goddess of the dead in Norse mythological systems. In the serious and cold nature of Hades, ruler again of the land of the dead and its inhabitants. You see Saturn invoked in the black judge's robe. Again, strict duty, authority, that gavel of authority, the immovable line. First level neophytes in Catholic priestly grades wear the black of Saturn, the black of the material plane. The black of Saturn also gives them that costume of authority. You see it in a lot of European police uniforms. You see it also in how a lot of villains are depicted. Voldemort wears black. Darth Vader wears black. Venom from Spider-Man comes from that black void also of cold space. Maleficent in Disney's Sleeping Beauty, literally Maul, as Saturn, the black dragon, is the greatest of the maledictory planets. Those are instances also where you can see how Saturn gets this bad rap with the less informed public as being this bad thing, when what's actually being related is this negation side of things as opposed to a positive pole, and it doesn't necessarily make it villainous, but that's how it's usually portrayed. But you get how it really is worked in everywhere you turn. This black Saturn material plane, like at Western funerals or worn by the Grim Reaper. Again, the negation, death, the deathly side of things. Planetary magic attributes being actively acknowledged and invoked in almost everything we do. Just as it's the binding side of things, right? You see the binding attributes in symbols like wedding rings, a literal band, a ring that binds a union, a piece of jewelry that speaks directly of Saturn's powers of obligation and duty. It's a circle demarcating a boundary, just like the rings of Saturn itself. This is far from everything there is to know about Saturn in the occult. It's endless, and it's far from what you will come to learn of it just by beginning the process of noting its correspondences. But hopefully this should get you headed in the right direction when approaching Saturn in your own planetary magics and comprehending its influences around you as they present themselves. Until next time.